Okay, ready to start, everybody. Got a bit of feedback. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining the seminar today. Thank you to those online. We have a lot of people online, so you're very welcome. Today, we're going to be introducing a big program of work called It's a large research program. We've just got through the inception period of 1 year. So we're moving into the implementation, which is going to be 2.5 years more. And we thought it's about time we let everyone know what we're actually doing, because people talk about basic, but I don't know if people really know what it is we're doing. So this is our opportunity to tell you about the program and get excited about it. So I'm Rachel Spartas-Wheeler. I'm a fellow here at the Institute of Development Studies. And I'm with Jeremy Lind, Paul Harvey, and Rachel Slater, who's probably online. She's also part of the directorship management of this program. So the research partnership for BASIC includes the Institute of Development Studies, the University of Sussex, particularly Migration Centre colleagues, University of Wolverhampton, the IRC, Mercy Corps, and other partners in different countries that we'll be working in. So welcome, and we're going to be talking about strengthening responses at the nexus of social protection, humanitarian aid, and climate shocks in protracted crises. So you might think, gosh, that is a mouthful. It's pretty much a head full. So we're going to spend the next 30 or 40 minutes talking about what we mean by that, unpacking some of those terms and concepts. Then there'll be 25 minutes, we hope, for discussion and questions. And I just want to let you know how that's going to work. People in the room, if you'd like to raise questions or comments, because of COVID restrictions, we would ask you to come up to the mic here and make a comment. It's not too scary. I've done this before. And for those people online, if you'd like to put any comments in the chat box, we're going to be monitoring the chat box, and we'll be reading out some of those questions and we'll respond to those. Okay? Great. Okay, so what is the challenge that this research is responding to? Just let me flip. So crises are often, very often, protracted. We tend to think of crises as quite acute and sudden. Gosh, there's a tsunami, quick, we better go in and help. But actually, evidence shows that the majority of recipients of humanitarian aid receive it for over 5 years, sometimes 15, 20 years. For example, say if you take Ethiopia, over the 80s and 90s, the same people receiving assistance year on, year out. And over 80% of humanitarian aid is allocated to crises that are much longer than 5 years. So it's not necessarily a short-term response thing, it's actually long-term protracted response that looks very similar to what social protection, we'll talk about these terms in a minute, is set up to provide. Social protection that's often aspirationally provided by the state is often to provide regular assistance to people who are chronically vulnerable, poor. So because there's this recognition that shocks are actually, they become protracted crises, and actually the same caseload, the same people need recurrent support, there's been a big sort of policy momentum about how can we help humanitarian actors and social protection actors and climate actors start talking to each other. How do we break down those silos and think about how to better align our programs? So Jeremy is going to talk a little bit more about what social protection means in a minute, but historically, social protection is focused on big shocks that are quite specific to climate, like drought, flood shocks, and also more recently, the pandemic. And there's been very, very limited attention to the type of shocks such as conflict, crises to do with fragility, political situations where you have, breakdown of systems. So that's kind of where the gap that basic research is filling. We're coming in from a situation of context where we say there's a protracted crises. And so the question that we're going to hopefully answer, partially answer, no doubt, is in protracted crises, how can international, national, and local actors work together to strengthen commitments and effectively, efficiently, and sustainably provide social assistance to those in need? So that's our big question. And if you were to unpack it, you can see that there's a big sort of political line of research there, thinking about how these different actors can work together. What are the constraints to them working together to better provide for the most vulnerable? And there's also a lot of research that's actually around operations. How do you best target? How do you best actually implement? So that's our big question. And I'm going to hand over to Jeremy.
So as Rachel has already covered in her introduction, basic research focuses on three big concepts: social protection, humanitarian aid, and climate-related shocks. And specifically, we're looking at how these intersect. So it's, if you will, the nexus of these concepts is where the research is focused, and in protracted crisis settings. These are also three areas of distinct programming and policy processes, and also three areas of intervention that are often financed in different ways. So we will briefly review each of these in turn to highlight areas of debate that we are interested in before I hand back to Rachel and Paul to discuss the framework and research agenda for basic research. So just to start, first of all, with social protection. This emerged within the context of international development and aid. This was a concept that emerged in the early 2000s. And social protection promised, through the provision of regular and predictable transfers, to deliver both consumption security for the poorest, as well as livelihood security for those who were vulnerable. And social protection refers to a set of policies and programs that are aimed at preventing or protecting all people against poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion through their life cycles, with a particular emphasis on those who are most vulnerable. The instruments of social protection are commonly described as comprising of three different pillars: so social assistance, social insurance, and labor market programs. And it is the first of those pillars, social assistance, which would refer to a cash, food, or asset transfer, where basic research is most interested. So again, social protection as a concept began sort of spreading in its influence from the early 2000s. And we've seen over the last 15 years a steady expansion of what are often called safety net programs across countries in Africa and Asia, elsewhere in Latin America. And many of these have been developed and focused on contexts of relative stability, where provision is ideally provided through national-led or state institutions. But there has been more recently a push for more domestic financing of these, although we see that in many cases, even for safety nets that have been existing for many years, these are funded largely through international aid. In more recent years, there have been advances in what is called shock responsive social protection. So the provision of assistance as a response after a large covariate shock. So there's been a push to integrate social protection in disaster response. This is very much a policy ideal, but still scalable safety nets, or flexing a safety net so that it covers more people or provides deeper assistance to those who are regular recipients, that is still a preliminary development. And importantly, for our work, is still something that is mostly happening in contexts with more developed social protection systems. Of course, in many protracted crisis settings, the existing social protection systems, if they do exist, are much weaker. Another key concern for the basic research program is that the emphasis on shock response does not address challenges around routine delivery in protracted crises, where the issue may be around sustaining support to beneficiaries, and also the resilience of systems when an armed conflict erupts. So for example, what is happening currently in Ukraine. So the second concept that the program is engaging with is humanitarian assistance. And the distinctive approach of humanitarian aid is to maintain a principled, neutral, impartial, and independent approach. And this is seen as being necessary to enable aid to reach people on all sides of the conflict. The international humanitarian aid is premised around the idea of supporting people with life-saving assistance when national and local capacities have been overwhelmed. Therefore, the underpinnings and operational modalities are premised around the idea of substituting for states when they are not able to act to alleviate suffering. At the same time, international humanitarian actors are committed to respecting the primary responsibility of states to assist and protect their own citizens, and substituting for states in the provision of assistance and services would be a last resort. Social protection is often framed as an opportunity for linking relief and development by moving from the provision of humanitarian assistance to more nationally led systems and longer term social assistance. Yet the tensions between development commitments to national ownership and building state-led delivery systems and humanitarian commitments to neutrality and independence are ones that are often underanalyzed and are very much a core concern for basic research. So in some cases, strengthening social assistance may involve improving ways of working around the state and strengthening non-state systems of delivery. So finally, the third key concept, the third leg of our stool, if you will, is responses to climate shocks. And social protection over the last decade has more and more been seen as a way of reducing the impacts of climate-related shocks, something that is often referred to in terms of absorptive capacity, so being able to absorb the impact of a climate shock, as well as increasing the resilience of recipient households and communities, what is sometimes referred to as anticipatory capacities. And there has been a proliferation of policy agendas in this area, including adaptive social protection, shock responsive social protection, which we've briefly talked about, and climate responsive social protection. However, longer term trends and the implications of these for people's livelihoods or their needs for adaptation receive less attention than do a focus on shorter term shocks and stresses. Responses to short-term shocks, however, will not automatically lead to long-term resilience. And on the contrary, decisions taken in the short term could in fact affect the prospects for longer-term transformative change or even contribute to maladaptation. And finally, a further concern for us within basic research is that the climate responsive social protection agenda has been quite blind to conflict and political fragility as a related shock. So in as much as safety nets have been adding shock responsive elements, often these are based on triggers related to climate and agriculture and less to political ruptures, to conflict and violence that might happen.
Okay, so what Jeremy's been talking about, the sort of bringing this together in terms of a framework for how we frame the research, how we move ahead. we developed two areas. We're looking at social protection contexts and dimensions of fragility. So I'm going to briefly talk about that. So until now, we've talked about social assistance, social protection, as though it's, you know, you go into a country and it all looks the same. But of course, it doesn't. And in fact, obviously, in any country or any region of a country, you'll have a very different setup in terms of a system of social protection. So this is a kind of categorization of ideal states at each end. Well, one end, the highly shock responsive social protection at the very bottom would be your ideal, where you've got a social protection system. And when I mean that, I'm talking about registration systems, accountability mechanisms, targeting mechanisms, policies, the whole thing. And you'll have it institutionalized within state structures, and it will be pretty much rights-based form of social protection. And that kind of system would be able to respond very quickly and nimbly to shocks. So if I was to be in a bad situation, I could go to the state and say, I've got a right, I need my welfare payment, I need my social assistance. And that would be your ideal scenario. But of course, in any place, you'll have a different scenario. You could have somewhere at the top, you would have very little structure, system structure, or a severely weakened system, particularly in the type of context Jeremy's just been talking about, where you've got a conflict crisis, perhaps it's ruined your state infrastructure or delivery infrastructure. And that would be a place where there isn't any formal social protection provision. And you might have some structures existing less formal, like you might have faith-based organizations providing, you might have collective remittance structures. So there's all forms of different social protection. But in terms of more formalized, you haven't got much there. And of course, in between those extremes, you'll have different types of systems depending on what country you're in and even a region. So Northern Uganda might have a very different setup than, say, the rest of Uganda. It's quite hard to say the whole country's got one. So there is a way, this is obviously conceptually distinguished. This has not been empirically, we don't empirically identify this. Maybe that's something that could be done, but you can pretty much think about, if you know a system well enough, or you know a country and the way it's set up in terms of its social protection, you'd be able to say, okay, well, it's more or less here on this continuum. So we have that as one element of the framework. The next element of the framework, well, is thinking about different types of crises. So what do we mean by protracted crises? The concept protracted crises is clearly not a unitary thing. It conceals a variety of settings and situations whose dimensions, as well as drivers of insecurity and conflict, they vary enormously, right? We've just talked about climate types of shocks, conflict types of shocks, sort of political insecurity. There's massive, massive variation going on when we say protracted crisis. And generally, protracted crises refers to places where authority is often contested, war might be ongoing, governments can be party to conflicts, they might not have effective control over all their territory, and or non-state armed groups might be present. And in addition, we're also looking at this sort of climate fragility, that kind of space too. So it's lumping a lot together. So we actually have to try and untangle all that for the purpose of, you know, what we're going to be saying in the research. You know, how do you actually work in these different spaces? Because it's not going to be a blueprint, obviously. So basic research is going to be focusing on places where there's multiple dimensions of crises and insecurity and fragility overlapping. And we're going to have to struggle with that as we go through. But there's some key considerations we're going to have to think about for what configuration of provision is going to be most feasible and appropriate. And some of the questions we'll be thinking around is the state involved in the armed conflict or not? If so, does that change the way we might provide assistance? Are unofficial authorities present or not? Do you work with them? Are you allowed to work with them? Can't you work with them? How does that work? Are refugees present or not as a big phenomenon? And what does that mean in terms of, do we just have the UN involvement, or can the state also, does the state recognize the rights of refugees? That's going to very much affect how you create provision. So bringing those two dimensions together, just conceptually speaking, you could think of, say, along the vertical axis, the type of situation you're in terms of crises, places where you've got you've got protracted crises, and then places where you have recurrent shocks, but no sort of enduring crises. So obviously this is very aggregate. I've just told you we need to unpack these terms in a big way. But you could think, okay, here's a situation where we've got like a really difficult situation to work in. And then along the other axis, you could think of the nature or the type of system that exists, provisioning system, social protection system, a very weak system versus a very strong system in terms of those categories I showed you. And you could put countries and or regions in different places on that 2x2, which we have done. And for our purposes, basic research, our research will be focusing very much on the top layer of countries, those countries that do experience protracted crises, but there'll be different contexts in terms of the social protection system. So I'm just going to give you, last slide that I'm going to talk to is our research agenda. I've got some handouts here in case you actually wanted to see in more detail what kinds of questions we're going to be asking, or we are asking. I'm not going to read all these questions just now, but our primary focus, we've got 4 countries that we're going to be doing more deep engagement with: Lebanon, Niger, well, northeastern Nigeria, that's an area, and Yemen. And we've got a bunch of other countries, but in particular, we're going to be looking at Ethiopia in quite a bit of depth, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, but you could see our documents and go online. We've got a lot of research papers that have recently come out that please go and have a look at. And the big 4 thematic areas that we're going to be looking at are along the top of that table: politics and political economy, climate and livelihood resilience, inclusion and participation, and systems for design and delivery. So like I said, I'm not going to read you those questions. I can easily send you to find them if you're interested. So that's what we're doing. I'm going to hand to Paul, who's actually going to reflect a little bit for us to get some discussion going.
Thanks, Rachel. I need your mic. Great. We want to get to discussion and questions quickly. I'm seeing lots of things we need to respond to in the chat, so I won't take too long. In thinking about what we're going to be doing over the next 3 years in BASIC and what we've been trying to do over the last year in terms of shaping our research agenda, 3 crises over the last year for me have illustrated what the issues we need to explore in BASIC are, why they're important, and why there's a need for better evidence to explore informed policy and practice. And when we were kicking off the inception period, the war in Ethiopia was starting. And that was interesting because for many years, Ethiopia was kind of held up as a good example of a successful transition from decades of humanitarian aid to a more nationally led social protection system, one that was becoming increasingly shock responsive through the productive safety net program. And so was an example of all of this being done well and properly, but then the war started. And of course, now there are huge question marks over what's happening to the productive safety net program. There's certainly very little of any assistance getting through in Tigray, so it seems safe to assume that people from there are cut off from it, but also huge questions about what's happening to social protection, social assistance entitlements in other parts of Ethiopia that are conflict affected. And it illustrates the need for sort of capacities to pivot between humanitarian and development approaches, to not be completely bought into the idea of supporting and working with and through states in countries that may switch between conflict and less conflict and fragility. And then of course, there was the takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan. I don't know if in Afghanistan, a context where you'd had over 20 years of huge investments in state building, in trying to encourage sort of national systems like the National Solidarity Program and then the Citizens Charter of ways of getting assistance to people. And the takeover of the Taliban, throwing all of those into confusion and doubt, throwing all of the systems of delivery up in the air, and raising huge questions about what then organizations could try to do to pivot in order to be able to continue to provide assistance to people. Huge questions about the sort of mechanics of financing mechanisms, but also about how aid agencies and other international actors engage with national and local authorities and actors when there are these sudden transitions. And as slightly similarly in South Sudan in 2013, when the war restarted there. And then most recently, of course, there's Ukraine. And there's a huge humanitarian response gearing up. The DEC launched an appeal today, I think, for humanitarian aid in Ukraine. But for me, there's lots of interesting questions about the existing social protection system. In Ukraine, people receive pensions, they receive child benefits, and are those still being paid? In what parts of the countries are they still able to be paid? Is there scope for international aid to provide greater support to existing systems? Could we double pensions for the next 3 months or dramatically increase child benefits as one way of getting assistance to people as a complement to international humanitarian action that's substituting for the state? And so these crises have, for me, illustrated what we need to explore in BASIC, the sort of places we need to explore it in. These are all sort of real current challenges that governments and aid agencies and civil society are grappling with in trying to get assistance to people in Ethiopia and Ukraine and Afghanistan. And indeed, in other crises that are less high profile, but equally important. There's a looming famine in Somalia and a huge problems with drought. There are over 1 million people in northeast Nigeria who are unable to get any assistance at all, either from government or international aid actors. And so we're hoping that basic research will contribute to making decisions about how best to navigate those challenges in these difficult places and to make those decisions more evidence and research based. In doing that, I should say, because I've just noticed who's on the chat, we're going to be working closely and coordinating with a sort of BASIC is FCDO-funded. Part of that is basic research led by IDS. Part of it is a technical assistance facility led by DAII, and that will provide where FCDO country posts and others can draw on technical assistance to inform the sorts of decisions we're just talking about. And so we'll be working closely with STAR colleagues. The acronym is STARR, and I can't remember what it stands for, but I'm sure Valentina will put it in the chat. And we're going to be building on the amazing work they did through space, which was looking at social protection responses to COVID. And there's a whole wealth of materials there that, again, I'm sure someone will put in the chat. As Rachel said, we're just starting to publish working papers from the inception period. So if people are interested in these issues, there's, I think, 6 great working papers have just been published over the last 2 weeks that are all on the IDS website, and more coming in the next few weeks. And if you're interested in these issues, want to follow what we'll be doing over the next 3 years, then we've just launched our LinkedIn page and it's up on there. So do whatever you do with LinkedIn, sign up to it, join it, I'm not sure. And we'll do our best, obviously, to stay in touch with you and tell you about the research we'll be doing and the findings that are emerging from it. That's it from me. So the floor is open for questions from people here and from online. And I will, someone come up if they've got a question here, come up because you need to come to the mic, and that will give us a chance to have a look at the chat on the online.
Thanks a lot for an amazing session. I read your paper on financing and social protection scenarios and assistance, and some very interesting ideas in the direction for research that definitely will be explored in the next 2-3 years. So as I think you started with the presentation in which the research showed that in crisis less than 5 years, major aid goes there. So majorly we need to find out sustainable ways of financing these protracted crises. But let's take an example of Ukraine, in which $277 billion were recently raised on war bonds with 11% yield. But it could be raised because there's some certainty and assumption that it will be a short-term crisis and conflict. And then the economy will be able to pay in some time and definitely the support and all that. In protracted crisis that goes more than 4, 5, 6 years, medium to long term, how to create those sustainable sources of financing? And how do we keep on like sustaining that for a long time, medium to long term, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, related to climate finance, fragility or conflict zones? So
we're going to take
yeah, we'll take a few.
Yeah, we'll take a few comments in the room. When you come out, if you introduce yourself as well. Do you want to just say who you are? No, okay.
Yes, I'm Kareem Javed and I'm doing MA Copy.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else in the room like to add a question? Yes, please come up to the mic. This is the fun of hybrid meetings, everyone, and COVID. We're not allowed to move the mic around. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Fatehullah. I'm from Afghanistan and a student here at IES. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to meet you and also hear about the basic project. Thank you for bringing up the question and also the concern about my country. Having experience of living in such a crisis situation, like gave me the motivation to come and ask you the question. I done a brief reading about the basic project. It's a great project. I'm happy that at least some research will be happen and that will lead the future like aid provider or international practitioner that at least consider what is happening in the reality and how to align their response. My question is about you mentioned that it's a crisis conflicted area that four countries that major concern on the basic project. My question is about the is the basic project focus on how to build the resiliency of the community after crisis somehow calm down? Because in the context, actually there is a problem from the crisis, or I mean from in the transactions stage, from the emergency when you are transacting to the normal state, or at least for how to make it sustainable. International aid agency or those that doing providing humanitarian aid in the ground, they are somehow making like causing dependency of the community to like they are all aid dependent and keep it as an ongoing operation. So would you focus on this and like at least at policy level, would you provide some recommendations how to transfer from that stage or not? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, one more question from the room. Yes, please come up.
Hi, my name's Nick. I'm also an MA Gov along with Kareem. And so one of the questions I have is actually about emergent technology and specifically financial technology and the implications for cash delivery and a lot of social assistance programming and how much your research is looking at forward planning for fintech evolution, new digital ecosystems in the delivery of cash assistance in protracted conflict.
Great question. Thank you, Nick. So we'll take the questions from the room and then we'll go and get some questions from online. Paul, I'm going to hand to you first about the financing one.
Good question. I'm not sure it's one we have an answer to, but I think it's the right question. Too often it relates to questions in the chat as are we looking at sort of anticipatory action and financing. And I think too much of both the sort of literature and the policy on anticipatory financing is focused on relatively short-term responses to climate shocks and ways in which you can have better anticipatory action and better anticipatory financing to respond to those, which is fine, but is problematic given that 80% of humanitarian aid is spent in long-term protracted crises where the problem isn't short-term responses, the problem is sustaining finances over decades in the face of donor fatigue and as you know, needs continue, but it's just a struggle to keep things going. And yes, our research will be looking at that, but I certainly don't have an answer to it, and I'm not sure that there is going to be a good one. It's about the need to have donors maintain commitments to helping people in crisis, even if they go on for a very long time, and that's hard to do. On the question on resilience and dependency, it's not something we'll directly be addressing, but I think it's part of the sort of the wider framing. Rachel will talk about it more in relation to work that we might be doing around livelihoods. Just on dependency, because it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, I always find the term deeply problematic. I think people should be able to depend on assistance in crisis, and that's a good thing. And that the idea that dependency is problematic because people come to over-rely on assistance needs to be questioned and challenged whenever it comes up. And I will hand over.
Yeah, not much more to add to that. I completely agree with what Paul has emphasized about reliance on assistance being something that we should aspire to in these places. And certainly I think we would tend to view the provision of social assistance as being a critical part of how you build resilience after the worst of a crisis has passed. I think that was sort of the specific angle of the question that you asked. Obviously, going beyond social assistance, such as through livelihood programming, cash plus programs, is something that we're also interested in. And we do have a new working paper actually from BASIC that's available on the IDS website that specifically looks at, well, what is happening with cash plus programming in protracted crisis areas. And just based on our very initial work in this area, we've seen that many of these programs are quite small scale. In many cases, they're pilot programs, but there's a striking lack of evaluation evidence on these. It's very, very hard to find evidence of their outcomes. So that is going to be one of our very initial pieces of work this year, is trying to comb further and deeper to find evidence of how livelihood strengthening in protracted crises happens through cash plus.
So I think Jeremy and Paul have answered a lot of that. Yes, the livelihoods, we've got a strong focus on livelihoods, and we're actually going to be put in place 2 sort of mixed methods, big surveys in Niger and Ethiopia, that's going to be looking at livelihood pathways and the dynamics of livelihoods and vulnerability, and how does social assistance or humanitarian aid mediate or change people's livelihoods, and what are some of the issues there. So that's a big piece of the work. The question on digital, really a great question. Again, we've just put a paper, research paper on that. Becky Faith and Tony Roberts from IDS are leading work on digital. I wish they were here to talk about it, but it's absolutely part of our work. It'd be great if I can link you up with them, because they'd probably be really interested. But it's very much exactly around how do we deliver cash in a way, in a crisis conflict situation, for example, in a way that doesn't actually undermine beneficiaries, rights and their identity, and what are the best ways for using technology. So in fact, there was a blog actually Becky put out recently on this as well. So let's take a few questions from the online. Can you tell what the question is before you? Because otherwise.
No, I can. Just on next question. Yeah, Becky and Tony will be particularly looking at sort of risks as well as opportunities of the use of different technologies in order to get assistance to people, and obviously, as well as huge opportunities in relation to efficiency and effectiveness, there are huge risks in terms of protecting people's identity, and particularly risks in conflicts around that, as illustrated in Afghanistan with data breaches last year, and most recently with ICRC. One of the questions in the chat that you need to scroll back up to is why we're using the term social assistance, not social protection, which made me smile, because Jeremy, Rachel and I were just debating that before this meeting in relation to trying to finalize a paper. And there's 2 answers to that. One is that it was the term given to us by FCDO, and so we've stuck with it. The slightly better answer is, I think what we're trying to get at is what we're particularly interested in is the sort of interface and the interactions between social protection and humanitarian assistance. Social assistance is something of a hybrid term that creates definitional challenges and uncertainties, but that's kind of the point. We're at that place where it is sort of definitionally and operationally challenging, and hence the use of the term. I will hand over to someone else who's read the chat more recently than I have and has another question they want to ask.
Okay, I can take one question on whether we are looking at the relationship between climate change and conflict. Are we considering the interactions between climate events and conflict risks? We are not addressing this in terms of a different debate that is out there around the degree to which climate-related processes and factors are a contributing factor to conflict and violence. That is not what our research is looking at, but instead looking at compounding shocks, how you can better address vulnerability to climate-related processes in settings that are affected by violence and conflict. That is what our focus is. There was also an interesting comment that had been made around local governance. And so this is just a good moment for me to push one of our basic research papers that has come out recently looking at the politics of social assistance from the bottom up. So this is a very preliminary effort within the program to try and understand, well, what does the politics of social assistance look like at the subnational level? Yes, at the level of a district and below, in communities and in villages where governance is often hybrid, where non-formal actors are often mediating the provision of assistance that is coming through more formal channels. So these are issues that we have a lot of questions around. We think it's a really important area of work and is one of the key themes for the program going forward.
Okay, so I've seen from online and then we'll come back to the room. So Carla has posted, did I hear correctly, that basic research will be covering issues of inclusion of refugees and migrants into shock responsive social protection? Yes, you heard correctly. So we're working with Migration Centre at Sussex and others, definitely thinking around refugees in Lebanon in particular. Where else are we working on specifically that? Iraq, displacement, and we'll probably be looking a little bit at it in Nigeria and in Ethiopia in terms of IDPs. But yes, we are thinking about, for example, whether, particularly in regard to targeting, for instance, does a refugee, is a refugee recognized as having a right to social protection in the country they have come to? If not, if you're going to harmonize targeting mechanisms, does it even make sense? Should you be using the same poverty proxies for refugees living in camps versus a settled population? What does it look like? So we're going to be unpacking that quite a bit. And we have Emily Wild working with us, helping us with that. And also probably Fred Mertens will be supporting targeting in Yemen. And then there's another question or a useful piece of advice by Paola, who says that there's randomized evaluations in and on graduation programming in protracted crisis situations, which is fantastic because we've been reviewing a colleague of ours, Carolina Sipp. She's been looking at whether we can find any RCT evidence from protracted crisis situations to look at cash transfers, cash plus graduation programming. We thought we might have covered most of them, but perhaps we haven't. So we'll be in touch with you to find out if there's some more. Back to the room. Any other questions, comments? Provision, Dominic, please come up.
Hi, I'm Dominic Glover, a research fellow at IDS. So my question is about the broader context for BASIC, which has just very recently and tragically changed dramatically. So this is an FCDO-funded initiative. And we've seen in the last few days that more than 1 million refugees from Ukraine have already streamed into neighboring countries in Europe. So until quite recently, FCDO was setting out a stall for a pivot towards Asia. With the merger of DFID and FCO into FCDO, we had a foreign policy that was going to be reoriented more around national interests in terms of trade. We've also seen a lot of budgets slashed suddenly, including for committed programs funded by FCDO. So I just wonder if the 3 assembled members of this program would reflect on whether the current Ukraine war and the refugee crisis there and your relationship with FCDO, has this suddenly changed? Will it make a difference, or will it make your work more pertinent, more relevant, or what else would you take from the current situation? Thanks.
Any other a couple more comments or questions from here. Yes. Hi, Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily. I work in communications and impact. It's great to see that you're looking at the sort of local politics, and just wondered what happens when the social assistance comes from the kind of actors that are not very savory. I'm thinking of, like, you know, people like Boko Haram providing employment and all sorts of other things to local communities. And how does one manage that tension, you know, that on the one hand, the very people creating fragility and violence and instability are also, on the other hand, providing some sort of stability to the local communities, and how does one even engage with that? And I guess part two of that is, are we looking back up the way to the politics of aid as well, which is very unneutral in itself, isn't it? It's very politically driven. Or is that something that this research wants to stay well away from and just focus on, you know, the kind of delivery side of things? Thank you very much.
Dominic and Emmy, you're kind of, they're interlinked questions. I mean, yes, the politics of assistance are clearly central and important, and we couldn't neglect them because it shapes who's being engaged with, how, and in what ways. And Yemen's a good example of that, where 80% of the population live in the part of Yemen that's currently controlled by the Houthi regime. And what's possible and not possible to do with the Houthi regime is in part determined by the war that's going on, the parties to that conflict, and the view of Western donor agencies about whether you can and can't work with the Houthis. Hezbollah in Lebanon, another example, and so on. So yes, you know, those political questions are central to what we'll be doing, is trying to understand how you get assistance to people in these places and how you navigate those political challenges. On your question, Dominic, yeah, I mean, we were half expecting this program to get hacked, and somewhat to a surprise, it didn't. So, you know, we're excited to be able to start it with a surprisingly intact budget. But clearly, yeah, I mean, the politics of FCDO and others is changing all the time, and Ukraine might change that again. I think with Ukraine, you know, as I was saying, a lot of the issues that we want to explore through BASIC are beginning to play out, although in slightly different ways because of the context in Ukraine. So we see that as an opportunity for, you know, basic research to both look at what's going on there, but to think about what it means for the themes we're tackling. And then one of the questions on the chat was about how we're going to look at social assistance and issues relating to women and gender relations. And, you know, yes, we will. Clearly, we'll try and have a gender lens throughout all of the research. In particular, in the work we're doing on inclusion and targeting, we'll be looking at different forms of inclusion and exclusion, and different types of sort of marginalization and exclusion, including relating to gender, but also relating to things like disability and ethnicity, and again, the politics of who gets aid and who doesn't in crises. Joan, I'll hand over to one of you two.
Yeah, not much to add other than things to look out for from the program around global politics. Towards the end of the program, we are preparing a synthesis piece that will address dimensions of global politics in this space, in this debate across all of the work. So it's something that we're going to be reflecting on slowly through the course of the program, but then bringing that together into a document and likely an event towards later of next year or early 2024. We also will see it in a number of our country pieces. So whether that is looking at amalgams arrangements for assistance of displaced people in camps in Lebanon, or whether that is how to better address the needs of populations affected by war in Tigray in Ethiopia. There's multiple levels of politics and governance, including the international aid system and its role, that factor into what we're going to be addressing. So it's definitely an important angle for us.
Gary, did you have any thing from the YouTube?
No, just one from the Q&A.
Spencer, I was just going to answer you on can other researchers beyond the group get involved? So there's two answers to this. One is because you start with what you feel like a nice fat research budget, and then you divide it by 4 years and 4 and more countries, and Becky's trying to do it, and it's both hard and all the money gets spent surprisingly quickly. So, there's not a great sort of wallop of spare budget to hire lots more researchers. But of course, we want to be as collaborative and inclusive and possible. And so if people are interested in what we're talking about today and want to get in touch with us, that's very welcome. And we can think about ways to try and include and people, but we don't necessarily have a budget to pay for lots of their time.
Any other questions from the floor here? There's lots of comments in the chat box. People who are actually online will see, but not necessarily questions, really useful comments and useful resources that we're going to go back and look at later. Yes.
On the subject of useful comments in the chat, can we capture the chat?
Hi, I'm Ros Price. I'm a research officer at IDS. You talk about how you want to look at the long-term impacts and rather than short-term shocks, for example. I was wondering, what does long-term mean to you? Because obviously the program's only actually 3 more years. So I was just wondering how you can capture within that time these long-term aspects. Thanks.
Good question. So some of that will be based on quite a lot of well, fortunately in the inception period in a way, because COVID's been there, we've had to be quite creative about doing desk-based secondary data research, stakeholder interviews on Zoom. So we've actually managed to get quite a lot of really interesting stuff that perhaps we wouldn't have done if we were all flying off around the world looking at very current situations. So that's been helpful. You're right that it is a short program. So we're not going to see a huge amount of change, and that's been a little bit tricky for us thinking about the methods that we're going to be using. So, part of what we're supposed to do and we want to do is get longitudinal data, qualitative, quantitative, on what's happening to people's lives and livelihoods. And so I had said earlier, we're going to be doing these livelihood studies in Niger and Ethiopia in particular. Thankfully, Jeremy and I and people on the team have worked in Ethiopia for over 15 years. So we're hoping that's going to stand us in good stead. And we are hoping to be able to back another survey round onto ongoing surveys. So hopefully we'll be able to fund an extra round of someone else's survey and have access to it. So we're looking into that. That'll give us a nice longitudinal wave. But in terms of other ones, we'll be having, when we're interviewing, we'll be going to do retrospective data capture, and then hopefully we'll be able to follow up once more. But ideally also at the end of this round of basic research, there will be interest in following up work we're doing in the future. So hopefully we'll put a couple of interesting things in place that will make it useful in the long run.
And Jeremy, do you want to plug the Climate Centre partnership? So that they're doing some...
Yeah, I mean, specifically in relation to climate shocks, we are partnering with the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center. So there's some very interesting methodologies that they're also bringing into the work around storylines, where you're not only looking back, which is something we are doing as part of our climate research, but also thinking around different longer term climate scenarios and thinking about what change people expect and how they would respond around different scenarios. And that would then include thinking, therefore, well, how might social assistance and cash plus, for example, those sorts of more livelihood oriented approaches factor into that.
We've probably got time for one more question, Fazal. The honor falls to you, assuming you can make it up to the front. Assuming you can make it up to the front, that's all we need.
Hi, my name is Fazal. I'm working in IDS as a male specialist. My question is about the crisis situation. It's really a very difficult situation. Like emotions are just started when crisis started, and appeals are just launched, and money is coming, and people are just going to deploy people and start programs and support people. But internationally, these appeal funds, when they are shrinking and the funds are just reducing, then the pressure starts that people are just winding up their program and they're coming back. And then the people who are working there in those crises in the local area, they also have that tension because organizations are attached with the funding. They are project-oriented organizations. People are working there and they have jobs. Then the jobs are just, they lose jobs. So in that localization side, whether this research will be focusing on any research on that side as well, how it affects those local organizations and the people who are working in it.
Thanks, Fidel. So I mean, that brings us quite nicely full circle to, I think, the first question about sort of how you sustain financing. Yeah, and so one of the big challenges is definitely continuing to get help for people when crises fall off the radar, when they become less high profile, but as needs continue or indeed get worse. And that's both a financing challenge, but also a sort of operational challenge in terms of the ability to stay and to deliver. And one in which, yes, we will be thinking about what international organization commitments around localization mean in practice and how that relates to how you deliver assistance. And are there ways you can move to more nationally owned, sustained and local forms of social protection and social assistance in places where that's challenging because there's still a war going on, because authorities are both parties to a conflict and have responsibilities to deliver assistance, and it's navigating those challenges. That's what we'll be exploring. We should be wrapping up, so I'll hand over to Rachel and Jeremy in a minute for final comments. I'm going to plug LinkedIn again, because otherwise Alan will be cross with me. So do sign up to the Basic Crises LinkedIn page. And that's probably the best way of following all the brilliant research we'll be doing over the next 3 years. And we look forward to staying in touch with you about it. Do also follow Valentine Barker and colleagues and all the brilliant work that'll be coming out of STAR as it transitions from space to STAR. And together we hope to help to influence better ways of getting help to people in crisis.
Yes, thank you. Someone has said, can we confirm where the papers mentioned are being published? I think they are exactly on that link you put there. It's on the IDS website in the research program, Better Assistance in Crisis. You'll see the publications there, the blogs. Nobody's shaking their head at me, so that must be true. And thank you so much for everyone for coming. Thank you for all the comments online and here. We've got a lot to tackle. We obviously don't have all the answers, but hopefully we'll have a few more answers in a few years' time. Okay. Bye.